We are back. Twins, Senators, or Senators Twins, baseball, past, present, and future. And that Senators includes the original Senators, and we also talk a little bit about what became of the original Washington Senators. As you know, they went to the Twins, to Minnesota. And one of the co-hosts is here today. They're all here today. But Ronnie Rabinovitz actually works part-time for the Twins. And he's going to give us a little rundown about what he's been doing to keep the Jackie Robinson name alive. George Case III is here. How are you, George?
That's fine, thank you.
Good. We have two guests, Al Blumpkin, who's a mainstay of the network, and he's going to talk to David Hubler, returning guest, on his great book on the Washington Senators and Homestead Grays. The big question is why the Homestead Grays playing in the Washington ballpark. Homestead is from outside of Pittsburgh, I understand. I want to know how that came about. So let's start with David Hubler. Give us a little info on that, and we'll go around the horn and have all three of you guys ask Mr. Hubler, and we're going to go to Ronnie and have him talk about Minnesota. So it's going to be quite a fun show. Start out, David. Answer my question, if you would, how it came to be that the Homestead Grays shared the stadium in Washington with the Senators back in the day.
Yeah, well, thanks. Let me just begin by saying that the Homestead Grays sort of adopted Washington, and Washington adopted the Homestead Grays as their Negro League team. For several reasons. One, when they were playing in Homestead, which is, you're right, just outside of Pittsburgh, they played in a pretty rundown stadium, and they were not doing very well financially, as most of the Negro League's teams were. The Negro League teams supplemented their meager salaries by playing pickup games all during the week, which didn't count in the Negro League standings. So when they had the opportunity to play in Griffith Stadium, they sort of leaped at the opportunity because it worked. It was sort of a no-lose situation. Clark Griffith, who always needed extra funds to support his ball club and the stadium, was a very willing landlord to let the Homestead Grays come in and play a good number of their games. The games that counted in the Negro Leagues predominantly were on the weekends. So the statistics are very, very difficult to assess individual players because some of their statistics counted in the Negro League standings, some didn't. But anyway, prior to World War II, Washington had become probably the most liberal, I use that word very broadly, liberal southern city, which had a fairly large black population for many years. And so they began to play a lot more games in Washington because not only were they doing better, even having to rent the stadium, but also the crowds were very, very big in terms of where the other Negro League teams played. If you look at
Did Mr. Griffith have problems with the other teams in the league because he was, in essence, integrating?
No, because they only played on the weekends, and they only played when the Washington Nationals, was as they were known, were out of town, and they never thought of it as integration. It's interesting because so many people assume that Griffith was a racist was against integration of baseball, and that really wasn't the case. He was a businessman, and I've mentioned this before on the show that was his only business, was baseball. So he didn't have like the money that some of the big magnates had for like Anheuser-Busch and the Philco. These people had a lot of money, and baseball was a sideline to them. So the Grays were in essence, you could say, the sideline for Clark Griffith. He did well by them in terms of renting the stadium to them, and they drew very well here in Washington, especially during World War II.
David, how much?
I'm going to ask George Case III, whose dad, George Case Jr., barnstormed on occasion with these players of the Negro League, and I might remind that it was called that, the Negro League, back in those days. So, no slur, of course.
Yeah, you know what, Ralph? Let me just say about that. People have said to me, they said, well, you shouldn't call it the Negro League. I said, well, you can call it whatever you want, but it was known as the Negro League. That's what it was. And the fact is that Clark Griffith was not a racist. Clark Griffith, as David mentioned, it was strictly an economic situation. He was able to rent out Griffith Stadium to the Homestead Grays on days when the Senators were out of town and there was no income being generated by those empty seats. So often, as David also will mention, the Grays outdrew Washington in Griffith Stadium. So it was really a win-win for Mr. Griffith, for the Homestead Grays, and he was not a racist. It was strictly an economic decision. The fact that the Homestead Grays were playing in Washington, D.C. and drawing very well.
And George, I have to mention that in Kansas City, still today, the Negro Baseball Museum is called the Negro Baseball Museum.
Right.
Because that's the way it was known in those days.
That's right, Ronnie, it was. And I think if people are looking to be revisionist and say, well, you shouldn't call that, well, that might be so. It might be politically incorrect. But the historic
the way
name
it was
the Negro League, and the same thing with the museum. It was not called the African American Museum. It was called the Negro League Museum.
Right, exactly. And it still is.
Good. Baseball, the world in general, has gone back race-wise. Several instances this year of racial slurs. Boston, especially, signs screaming at Adam Jones earlier in the years. Do you get questions, Ron, when you have children on your tours? Are there kids that just don't know what's happening? Does the subject come up with?
It does come up, Ralph. It does come up.
In what context does it?
Well, a lot of the younger kids don't really know what's going on, but the older ones and the teenagers, they do, especially the baseball fans.
Right.
They're very aware of the Adam Jones incident, and they feel terrible about it. They think it was horrible, as do I. And it's unfortunate in this day, our racism and anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head again.
And anti-every minority,
Anti-everybody, right,
Mexican,
everything. And it seems like since President Trump was elected, that they all feel they have a license to do whatever they want to do. And it's disgusting, it's horrible, and it's deplorable. And the president refuses to knock down that, he refuses. So he's not helping the situation.
Yeah, well, we just have to step back and say that hopefully this is just a pebble in the road where society is just tripping a little bit, but we're not really going to regress, that his time in office will really be something that it encourages people to lead in different directions, because we're not getting leadership from the top. We have to get leadership from the churches, the synagogues, the state government, local municipalities. We have to stay in the search to make it a better climate. The climate warming stuff is getting crazy under the sky.
It's getting crazy. That's right.
Yeah.
And yet there's many politicians that don't acknowledge it.
Yeah, absolutely. But they're the same ones that are being paid by these big drug companies and these the oil companies. So we can get into that. Let's keep the baseball.
Ralph, let me just make one quick comment. You mentioned about if there was any problem with Griffith renting out the stadium. Keep in mind that in Chicago, Wrigley Field was used for the Midsummer Classic in the Negro Leagues, the East versus the West, and they traditionally outdrew the American and National League All-Star game. 55,000 people would fill the stadium. So I don't think that ever really came up, a charge against Griffith, because Wrigley did the same thing. But so I just wanted to point that out.
Al can speak to New York, the New York teams renting out Yankee Stadium, Polo Grounds, Ebbets Field. There was the Brown Dodgers.
Mm-hmm.
What about the Negro League in the New York metropolitan area, Al?
Negro League of the metropolitan area was there's a team right in the Negro Leagues called the Black Yankees. So I played in Yankee Stadium when the Yankees were on the road.
Okay, so the owners of the Yankees rented out Yankee Stadium as well.
Yeah.
So add them.
You had the Chicago and St. Louis, Detroit. You had basically Cleveland. You had basically all the. You forget that if you count Brooklyn, there were only 11 cities in the major leagues at that point.
Okay, when we think of the Negro Leagues in Washington, the Homestead Grays, naturally Josh Gibson's name comes up. Who are some of the other stars that we don't hear about as much?
Buck Leonard was on that team.
Buck O'Neill, yeah.
Buck Leonard.
Oh, okay.
But not Buck Leonard.
Buck Leonard. Buck Leonard.
Yeah.
Buck Leonard, yeah.
Who is considered
I think David has on the cover of his book, David, you have that photograph of the Homestead Grays in the Griffith Stadium dugout.
Yes,
and
that's right.
I believe Josh Gibson's in the middle, but also I think Cool Papa Bell is in that. And
yes,
Cool
that's
Papa
right.
Bell, certainly one of the greatest of all the Negro League players, and what arguably maybe the fastest. And I've always been interested in the career of Cool Papa Bell because my dad being a base stealer who was very fast, and Cool Papa Bell had legendary speed. So I'm glad that David had that combination photo on his book cover, the 42, I believe it was the 42 Washington Senators on one side and the Homestead Grays on the other, showing the connection of Washington baseball and the Homestead Grays.
Yeah, the 44 Homestead Grays, that was our second consecutive Negro League World Series championship. And yeah, Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson was there, Buck Leonard, and a couple of Dave Hoskins, and Jerry Benjamin, another fine outfielder. They were all in that photograph, and they're in the dugout there at Griffith Stadium.
Right.
And
I believe, David, if you have other photographs, didn't the Homestead Grays also have a W on their sleeve? I'm not sure whether that was just when they played in Washington or whether they played in Pittsburgh as well, but the W signified Washington as opposed to Homestead Grays. Grays were on the jersey front, and the W was on the sleeve.
Yes, that's very true. In fact, there's a very well-known photograph, which is also in the Nats and the Grays, of Josh Gibson. That's a typical on-deck pose with the bat and kneeling down. And he's in his Grays uniform. The cap has a G for Grays. And on the left-hand sleeve is a W, the block W, which the Senators and the Nationals used to indicate Washington.
Right. Right. Now, my question,
George,
David,
you have a story about running into Cool Papa Bell at the airport, if I remember. Why don't you recount that?
Who?
George, didn't you meet
George.
Cool Papa Bell at the airport?
Cool. Well, I didn't meet Cool Papa Bell per se, but I know that Satchel, always talked about Cool Papa Bell. The fact that, the legendary comment was that he was so fast he could jump into bed before the light went off. And of course, some people doubt that was a true story. Or on the other hand, they said there was a short in the light, and that's how he could do it. I mean, I really don't know, but it was a great comment, and that's the way Satchel was. I mean, Satchel had some wonderful anecdotes, and that was one of them about Cool Papa Bell.
Beautiful, beautiful. Al, you have some questions of our guest, David Hubler.
Yeah, David was. I noticed in your book on Cecil Travis that. Well, I'll tell you a little story. I first learned about him from that old Kadeko All-Star game where you spin the discs.
Oh yes, I remember that game. Sure.
Yeah,
I had one.
I got one of them one year when I was a kid, and they were giving all timers, and the shortstop they had for the American League was Cecil Travis. I had never heard of him up to that point.
Well, that's the Ethan Allen All-Star baseball game. Ron.
Right.
I mean, Allen. And the fact is, I've told people, and David, I don't mean to jump in here, but I've told people that game was invented, by Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen had been a great major league player himself, and then was the baseball coach at Yale when President Bush was his left-handed first baseman. So there was a long history of that game, and I also have that game. It was from 1946, which was the classic version. It had the All-Stars, all-time All-Stars, Gehrig, Ruth, Cobb, those players, and then they had discs of the current players, and it just so happened one of those players was my dad, and I remember playing that game by hours on end, and then at an antique show about 5-6 years ago, I happened to see the exact game, and I bought it, and there is my dad's disc. So I was so excited to find it because that game for me was hours of enjoyment. I had lost the game as I became an adult, and then I found it again in the exact version that I had as a kid. So I loved that game.
Yeah, it was very, very low tech.
Yes, it was. There were two things. First of all, there weren't enough catchers to have little leagues, and there weren't enough shortstops. So I can understand where Cecil Travis would have stood out to Al Blumpkin.
I never heard of him before that game. And then, back in those days, I had the primitive Tuck and Thompson encyclopedia. So I looked them up. All I had was games played and the batting average. They had nothing else in there.
Well,
Travis, he was a steady 300 hitter. He had 359 in 1941, which was second to Ted Williams in the American League that year. And what I wanted to ask is that was he drafted?
Yes, he went into the Army. In fact, I was going to mention that his career was actually shortened because he was involved in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, that I know. He got frozen feet.
Frostbite. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But and hit a 314 career hitter.
Or did he volunteer? Because I saw he missed a total of 4 years.
Yeah, I don't.
He wasn't there in 1942.
They, throughout the war, what happened was the War Department changed the rules. At one point, if you were over, I think, 31, I forget the actual age, but if you were over that age, you were safe. Then later on, at like 43 or 44, they lowered that age. But he was gone right after he was gone from the 42 season on. So he probably enlisted. I would think.
Well, you know what? I'm not sure whether Cecil and my dad were very, very close friends. Cecil did lose 3 years to World War II. As David mentioned, his feet were frozen in Battle of the Bulge. He came back in 45, never was able to regain his timing, and in 47 retired the same year my dad did. And Cecil, I'm not sure whether he enlisted or whether he was drafted. The players back then had to go before the draft boards. If they had a low number, they were called. And the fact is that Cecil Travis was called and faced combat. My dad was 4F because he failed the physical and he was allowed to keep playing. But in the case of Cecil Travis, he was probably adversely affected by World War II more than any other player. As Alan mentioned, he hit 359 in 1941, second to Ted Williams. Then he lost the years with World War II. He came back and was never able to regain his timing and was forced to retire. So Cecil Travis, and never received, and which really annoys me, never received even one vote for Hall of Fame consideration, and he was a great player.
In fact, he's been called the best ball player never to have been inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right.
He went from a 314 hitter before the war. In 46, he hit 252.
Right.
And this is another interesting thing about Clark Griffith. He told Travis in 40. He retired in 47. Travis. He told Travis he could stay as long as he wanted. That's how loyal Griffith was to his ball players.
Right.
But David, how beloved Cecil Travis was in Washington. And don't shortchange your dad. He was pretty darn beloved, too.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph. You know, it just, from a personal point of view, I mean, I knew Cecil Travis. My dad and Cecil and my mom and Cecil and his wife would talk all the time. They would correspond to one another, phone calls. So, I mean, I had a chance to talk to Cecil. And I know that it used to really bother my father because my father and other players, even Ted Williams and many players, acknowledged the greatness of Cecil Travis as a ball player. But Cecil was very quiet, very unassuming, and just, you know, said, hey, didn't blame the Battle of the Bulge and his frozen feet. He just said, you know, I lost my timing. And the fact is that Cecil was a terrific player, a great hitter, and a 314 lifetime average, and yet people have no idea who he was, how he contributed to the game, and his greatness as a player.
Right.
Yeah, if you add in a 252 batting average in 46 to the 314 career, you can imagine how much higher it was before 46.
Right.
Okay. George, let me ask you. You mentioned on a number of occasions your dad wasn't drafted because of his status, his injuries.
Right.
He went to work in a defense plan, like
that was part of the deal that President Roosevelt struck with Major League Baseball and Judge Landis at the time. Any Major League player who was classified 4F had to work in the defense industry during the off season. So my dad worked at a bomber plant, building bombers for the war effort, and yet was still allowed to play baseball.
What were the working conditions like there? Was the pay adequate? It's pre-union days, obviously.
Right. I'm not sure, Ralph, what the pay was because it's such a long time ago. But the fact is that those players, I remember my dad, he'd report to work on shift work just like every other player, and whether it was putting screws in holes or doing welding. I mean, I'm not sure. He wasn't a welder and he wasn't mechanically inclined, but he was able to contribute to the war effort by working on an assembly line and building. I believe they were Avenger World War II fighter bombers, and in Trenton, New Jersey, which was his hometown. So that's what he did in the off season. And if he had been able to play, I mean, been able to enter the war effort as a serviceman, he would be very happy to. I think he went to the draft board like 3 or 4 times and was failed each time. So his draft classification was 4F, which is unable to serve.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd be remiss if at this time I didn't ask you, George, to tell us about your CD set, because it fits right in to the times that we're talking about, and remind our audience where they can get it and how they can get in touch with you. Okay, well, here's what it is. Now, my dad and Mickey Vernon both took color home movies, and Jim Bankowski, who was a personal friend of Mickey Vernon, who I knew, Jim called me up one day. He said, George, why don't we put a DVD together of your dad's films and Mickey's films and their own personal narration and memories of that time during World War II. And that's what we did. We called it Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK. And it's color, 8mm home movies with a narration provided by my father and Mickey Vernon. It's not game action, and that's what I want to point out. It is not game action. It is behind the scenes, spring training, pregame promotions, batting practice, the old ballparks, and it's available through my website, which is www.timelessbaseball.com. Okay. Hello? Is Pepper, you have pictures of guys playing Pepper? Yes, I do. There's guys playing Pepper in the outfield at Griffith Stadium, and that's one of the things that's so much different about baseball today is that they don't play Pepper. No Pepper signs all over the place. A lot of people, a lot of young fans don't even know what Pepper was.
They don't know what it is.
No.
Right.
And I think, personally, that's one of the reasons why a lot of players don't even know how to bunt today, because they don't play Pepper. When you played Pepper, and I played Pepper as a kid, I knew what Pepper was. I played it all through high school, college. The pros play it, major league players, but they don't do it anymore. But Pepper taught you bat control and how to lay down a bunt properly, which today, if you watch players today, they're dipping their bat, they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff.
Right.
They're popping it up, they're hitting foul balls. They don't know whether to lay it down or how to lay it down along the first base line, the third base line, whatever the situation is, because in my opinion, it's just my opinion, it's because they don't play Pepper anymore. George, don't be so critical about their bunting skills. They can't slide either.
Yeah, right.
Well, they do a lot of head first slides. I'm not sure that's the way that the old timers like to do it, but if you look at a lot of pictures, I mean, guys do head first slides, but when my dad was playing, they rarely did a head first slide because they always felt that they were prone to injuries with their hands, and that's been proven several times already where a player will slide into a base. Yeah. They slide into first base unnecessarily. Sometimes to avoid a tag, you would have to. They'll slide head first into first base, endangering their hands and slowing themselves down. It's been proven that if you run through the proverbial tape, you'll get there faster. And
well, Brett Gardner did it yesterday against the Orioles. Slid into first base. He was safe, but he slid head first.
Yeah. Well,
George, can I interrupt for a second? I would like you to explain to the audience about Pepper, those people that don't know what it is. And I know a lot of them don't know. So,
yeah, well, Ronnie, thank you for asking that. Pepper is a game, right? It's not really a game. It's an exercise. And what they used to do, they'd have maybe 4 or 5 players lined up, and then they'd have a batter, and the batter would direct his bunts to, say, the right side or the left side of those players, and it really taught bat control. And where the name Pepper came from, I really have absolutely no idea. Maybe somebody else knows. But Pepper was what they used to play by the hour. All major league players during my dad's era and many years before that, played Pepper. And why there's signs why there's signs in stadiums said no Pepper, I mean, I really have absolutely no idea. I don't know, and I don't understand it. But, maybe there's something that had to do with liability or balls being hit in the stands. Yeah, playing it right by the stands and
They used to do it right by the stands, by the dugout. They used to do it.
Right.
But why they couldn't do it if it was liability? Why they couldn't do it at second base? Why the whole act of
You got the whole outfield too. You could do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, our video of DVD ball field to battlefield and back from JFK to, from FDR to JFK
FDR.
shows the Washington Senators players playing pepper in the outfield at Griffith Stadium, not near the stands. They playing in the outfield. That's where they used to do it. So, again, why the game is not allowed to be played anymore, I have absolutely no idea. But to me, it's bat training, and I guess it's because, people want to see the home run. They don't really care about bunts, but bunts are an integral part of baseball. You have to know how to advance the runner, and a bunt is a real weapon.
George, it
Very
also
few people know today.
Yeah, George, it also improved, helped the infielders with their reflexes in getting involved.
Exactly.
But let me tell you something. I just looked it up because my infallible friend Paul Dixon in his baseball dictionary. The first usage of pepper was reported in 1895 in the New York Press. And then talk about the ballparks that have no pepper or no pepper games. According to the Dixon Baseball Dictionary, the ban dated back to the 50s, 1950, and it stemmed from the fact that the field was sometimes damaged from pepper play.
Well, you know what? I'm not sure. You know what, David? I'm not sure what that means.
Well, I'm citing a source, so it's not me.
No, I know.
But it doesn't.
I agree. I just don't understand what the damage that they're talking about. I mean, I have no idea.
I know. I don't either. He also says that the term seemed to derive from pep as well as the peppy or peppery nature of the game. Both of these adjectives were fairly common in ballpark expressions before World War II. Okay. So, and it came up in the 1934 edition of American Slang as pepper and grasser. Yeah.
I used to remember pepper being played in the major leagues into the mid-50s at least.
Yeah, oh yeah.
50, 55, 56, 57. Sure. I remember that. And when I would go watch the Dodgers, when Jackie was playing, they would be right near the dugout, and they'd be playing pepper on the sidelines there.
Yeah, I don't remember it in the outfield, but I do definitely remember it along the base.
No, it was very common. I just wanted to mention the outfield because that's the color footage that's in the DVD. They're in the outfield. But when you're talking about, David, and that was interesting. If the name Pepper came from Pepe or whatever, it's just like baseball fans. Where did the name fans come from? Well, it was shortened by fanatics. That's what people were. So it could be that the name derived.
And we are fanatics.
Yes,
right. George,
hasn't changed one iota, and it's about the only thing about baseball that hasn't changed.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. It was remarkable. There's a shot in George's father's films of the players coming out at Tinker Field for spring training, and they come out of this sort of wooden hut with a screen door. And I always remember that shot because if you go to spring training these days, you're practically in a major league stadium with all sorts of facilities. I'm sure that room, that locker room, wasn't even air conditioned, of course.
No, I can tell you, David, it was not. And I've even seen photographs of the players. I think it was the Yankee players in their clubhouse during spring training, huddled around a coal stove. That's how they did it. It was very rustic. That's the way the game was played. The players thought it was just wonderful because here they are in the sunshine and they're playing, but it was rustic. It was camp-like. It had nothing, in common with the palaces that they use for spring training today.
Right.
George, did your dad bring the family to spring training, and do you have memories of those days?
Yeah, we did. Matter of fact, Ralph, we would drive down. One year we drove. Another time we took the train. I can remember, I think it was like a 2-day train ride out of Trenton, New Jersey with a sleeper car and an upper berth. I thought it was wonderful. And you'd be going to sleep and the train would be rocking and then you'd go into the dining car. That's the way they did it then. And totally different world. the players, a lot of the players, and I can remember being with my mom and dad, and when my dad decided to drive. I mean, I was only a little kid, but I remember how long it took to get down there, and then how excited we were to be able to finally be in Florida and spring training. So I did. I spent some time at Tinkerfield as a kid.
Huh. Amazing.
Good.
Amazing. That's great.
Al, some questions of David about his book, if you would.
Okay, David. I want to ask you about the composition of those talented teams. It seems like especially because of the war, that they had an awful lot of mobility there.
In terms of what?
In terms of the players, it seemed that the only real constants were Dutch Leonard and Sid Hudson from the pitchers, and George Case, and Mickey. I know Mickey Varner missed a year or two.
Yeah, he missed a year or two.
Yeah.
Another one we didn't mention was Buddy Lewis.
Right.
Who was also gone the same time. Now, Buddy Lewis was a C-47 cargo plane pilot during the war. And if you recall anything about the Asia Pacific theater there was a thing called Flying the Hump, which took you over Burma and the Himalayas and into China. And he did. Buddy Lewis actually flew 368 missions over the hump. He won a Distinguished Flying Cross for that. And on one of his trips, I forget who went along. Some official went along, or a reporter, and came back and said all he did was talk baseball the whole time we were flying. But he was another one who actually helped in the war effort, as did Dutch Leonard. There's an incident that I recount in The Nats and the Grays, where Dutch Leonard went off on a USO tour during the war in the winter of 1944. And he was mobbed by players, by soldiers and sailors. All they wanted to do was talk baseball with him. And he wasn't an entertainer like Bob Hope or the Andrews sisters. He just got out there and they would just throw questions at him, and he was mobbed. He almost got shot by one of the U.S. Army's finest sentries, who asked him his password when he was coming back to camp. And he was in a war zone. I mean, he was not, off on. So he was right in the middle of the war zone, and he forgot what the password was. And fortunately for him and for the sentry, when he got closer, the sentry recognized him and told him, "Don't ever forget your password again."
Right. That's a very good story, David, and that's exactly what it was. I mean, the players that weren't playing were in service. Dutch Leonard was in service. I think I've seen that photograph you're talking about, where he's actually in his Army uniform with a trench coat and his hat and that kind of thing. Yep. That's what they did. And the fact is that those players were doing what they could for the war effort. Zeke Benora, who was a great player, for Washington. A lot of people, used to laugh, say, Zeke was a great hitter, but a terrible fielder. But Zeke was decorated by General Eisenhower for his efforts during World War II in providing equipment and developing leagues for servicemen who wanted to play baseball. And that's what they did to break the tedium and the horrors of war. They would go out and play ball, and they loved it. So if Dutch Leonard and some of the other players were there to really help them and talk baseball, that's what they did, and they were making their contribution.
Yeah, and you talked about you asked about the consistency of the rosters. Griffith had another pal in Washington besides FDR, who was his close friend, and that was General Louis B. Hershey, who was the director of the Selective Service System, the draft board, in other words. And in fact, I have my draft card it was signed by Louis B. Hershey. I don't know how I got it. I think I know, but I'm not going to talk about that. But in any case, Griffith used to have lunch with General Hershey almost on a weekly basis. And he was able to convince Hershey, he couldn't get him to give complete exemptions from the service, But in a couple of cases, he was able to convince Hershey, don't take him till the end of the season. Wait till the season is over, because because Washington didn't do so badly during the war. They finished last place, 8th in 44. But that was the only time. They finished second twice during the war.
Right.
So it wasn't like they were really a bad team. People seem to think they were constantly a bad team. They weren't that bad during the war. It was only later on that they actually turned to be, when they officially became the Washington Senators, and they devolved into a terrible last place, 7th team.
Well, they did have, David, and as you mentioned, they did have 2 second-place finishes in 43 and 45, sandwiched around a last-place finish in 44 when the St. Louis Browns, of all team, won the American League pennant and played the St. Louis Cardinals in the 44 World Series. So, I mean, that was just, the way the game was, and the players, when Mickey Vernon went into service, Clark Griffith had to have a first baseman, so he brought, Joe Kuehl, and Joe Kuehl would later become the Washington manager in 1948. And I'm sure that very few people ever remember the name Joe Kuehl, but Joe Kuehl can go back and say, you know what, I took Mickey Vernon's place when Mickey was in the U.S. Navy, and that's who played first base for Washington.
Yeah, that's right. Did your dad ever talk about...
I was just going to ask if that was the same Kuehl who was the farm director with the Oakland A's for many years, or was
Ralph, I really do not know. Joe Kuehl, his name was spelled Kuhel. So I'm not sure.
It might have been this guy's name wasn't Kuehl. I can't think of who it was. It might have been his son, and that'd be an interesting story.
Very possible. Yep.
Yeah, George, you mentioned the St. Louis Browns winning the 44 pennant,
right?
And Washington was instrumental in helping them, despite the fact that the teams hated each other, because the Browns were such blatant racists. But I was wondering, did your father ever mention to you that story about when Dutch Leonard got the call from the gambler? He did tell you that story?
Yeah, they did, because as a matter of fact, that happened when Dutch and my dad were roommates. And Dutch and my dad were very close friends, and Dutch because my dad used to laugh, he said, well, Dutch, in those days there was no air conditioning in the rooms and that kind of stuff in the summertime, but Dutch would wear a wool sweatshirt to bed to keep his arm warm. Well, one day, they're in the room together, and Dutch gets a phone call from this gambler, saying, you know what, Dutch, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars if you throw the next game. And Dutch said it to my dad, and my dad said, Dutch, by all means, tell Ozzie Bluegee or Bucky Harris, whoever was the manager at the time, I'm not sure what year it was.
Bluegee, yeah.
Yeah, Ozzie Bluegee said,
no, it was that year. It was 44. It was 44. Okay. At the very end of the season. Had he thrown the game, Detroit could have won the pennant.
Well, there you go, and that's what it was. And that happened because Dutch and my dad were roommates, and my dad overheard the conversation.
Wow.
Yeah, because Leonard reported it so promptly, he wasn't penalized in it. Actually,
right.
He went out and pitched a great game and won.
Yeah.
But
he did.
It happened.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it happened in
Detroit.
The
only reason I knew about it was because I remembered my dad telling me that story. As when I was a little kid, I wouldn't have known what he was even talking about. But later on, when we used to talk baseball and the history of the game, and the fact is that Dutch Leonard used to come and visit. I mean, Dutch and my dad were very good friends, and here they were roommates. And my dad overhears the conversation and tells Dutch, absolutely, you tell Ozzie what just happened.
Yeah, I think he was offered $10,000, a fee like that, and
and in those days that was a big money.
That's
that was
right.
A huge amount of money.
Yeah. They never, as far as I know, they never found out who offered the bribe. But it was interesting that it happened in Detroit because Detroit was known, Nathan Detroit, known as a gambling town, and it was right at the very end of the season. I mean, his win gave the pennant to the St. Louis Browns.
Well, that was really interesting too, David.
How many podcasts have a Guys and Dolls reference?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Hey, Ralph.
Right? And I wonder how many of it, I'll bet all of you guys picked up that was Guys and Dolls. I wonder how much of our audience picked up on that.
That's right. What was the name? Nathan Detroit, right?
Nathan Detroit, yeah. I think it was what's his name played it in the movie, Marlon Brando.
And how about Vivian Blaine as Adelaide?
I thought Marlon Brando was a little miscast, especially when he had to sing. But
right.
But it's
Ralph.
Yep.
Yes.
Ralph, I wanted to give you an update on the Twins. I've got to take off here. My grandson's having a baseball tournament today at noon. So
number 42.
Number 42, right. So I just want to give you a quick update on the Twins.
Please.
They've been coming along very, very well. However, the last 2 games, they've lost 2 games. The Angels have won 2 games. So the wild card, they're only 1 game ahead of the Angels at this point. So it's getting pretty tight.
Angels have come on.
They have.
They're playing good ball, proving not trading Trout was a good idea.
Right.
You don't trade the best player in baseball. Go ahead.
So 1 game out on that wild card. And no matter what happens, the Twins have certainly had a successful season. Last year at this time they were 55-93. Now they're 77-71. So that's a 22-game win spread, which is tremendous. So even if they don't make the wild card, I think that it'll be considered a very successful season. But they're definitely in the hunt.
Ronnie, it was a very successful. It's been a terrific season so far. So I know you're happy with that, and I know now that you're happy because your beloved Dodgers are now winning a couple after trying to lose them all. And so I think they're down to, what is there? There's about a 9.5 game lead or something with about
9.5 game magic number is 5.
Yeah, there you go. So I think you're excited about that, and your grandson will be real happy wearing his number 42.
That's
hey,
right.
Ronnie, let me just throw in a quick kudos for the Twins. When I was writing the book in 2013 and 14, 14 was the year, I believe, it was the year that the Twins hosted the All-Star game. And,
yes, that's correct.
And I went to the Twins publicity office because I was looking for some photos of some of the old Washington players who then moved on to Minnesota. And I didn't expect a reply because they were so tied up with all the work toward the All-Star game. But they came through so quickly and did a great job of finding me all these photos, didn't charge me anything to use them. I thought that was really a nice thing for them to do.
Great. Kudos. I think it was a guy by the name of Clyde.
But Clyde Debner, who's been on this show.
He's been on our show. Clyde Debner is the historian for the Twins, and I'll bet he's the one. He is tremendous at helping people.
Yeah. You know what, Ronnie and David, I want to mention something when you talk about that. And again, I think that the Twins have done a wonderful job. To me, there's the correlation between the Senators and the Twins. But on the other hand, I have tried, and I've had friends try to get any cooperation from the Washington Nationals about, going back and looking at the history of the game in Washington. Absolutely none. I mean, I've written a couple letters. I haven't even gotten a reply, not the courtesy of a reply.
Wow.
And to me, that is inexcusable, and I applaud the Twins for doing what they've done because there is a very strong connection between Washington baseball and Minnesota.
Of course there is. And Clyde Debner,
what's very interesting is that the San Francisco Giants play more homage to the New York Giants than the Mets do to the New York Giants.
Right.
Great correlation there. I can't.
Well, but the Mets are a combination of just by their colors, they were a combination of the Dodgers and the Giants. And they really
I understand, but to have a stadium, with all respect to Jackie Robinson, outside of Citi Field, he deserves to be outside. A statue of Jackie deserves to be outside of every stadium in organized baseball. But they should have They should have a Gil Hodges. They should pay homage to their own. That's
well, Ronnie, we'll get Richard Zamoff. We'll put Richard Zamoff on it, okay?
Yeah, you know Richard, don't you?
Yeah, oh yeah, I grew up with him.
He's my dear friend.
I know.
I'm going to have him on a podcast Tuesday night with Peter Trunk.
Oh, okay.
He's terrific.
Okay.
Yeah,
oh, wow.
He's terrific.
I'm hoping we can all get together when you come into Washington next time.
I'm hoping to come in November. So
yeah, you say.
I'll let you know.
Okay, great.
Right.
Great.
Yeah, it'll be great. I'd love to. Yeah.
Beautiful.
All right.
Hey, we're getting up against the time. I want you to all, I'm going to start with Al, complete it. Any thoughts, anything you want to talk about?
No, I read the earlier book a couple of years ago called Shadow of the Senators, or Behind the Shadow of the Senators.
Yes.
About this situation, and David's book has given me a better understanding of what went on at that point.
Beautiful. George.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I was just, again, David is somebody who I worked with and was very, very excited to help in developing his book and providing with some information and photographs, and I think he did a wonderful job. And my personal, recollection of Washington baseball and what he talks about in his book is right there. And I think he researched it and did a wonderful job, and I hope it's doing well. I believe, David, it's now available in paperback as well.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's been available since late spring. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Wonderful.
Great. David, I hope you'll come back soon. Al Blumpkin, you are the Tommy Heinrich of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. You're solid as can be. And,
old reliable.
Old reliable. I am so indebted. George, every week you just keep it alive. And
he's great. You're great.
Thank you. It's always enjoyable for me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Me too.
And Ronnie, what you do to keep Jackie Robinson's name alive is wonderful.
Thank you.
Keep doing it. You've got groups of kids coming into the Minnesota Stadium on what is it, every 2 weeks? Am I correct?
Every couple of weeks or so. Yeah. Every couple of weeks. Sometimes
very nice.
It's more often, sometimes less. But
coming out, book being written on you and Jackie and your friendship and Jackie's life after baseball, which really hasn't been explored much in any of the writings about Jackie. So Cindy James is writing that, and you have an upcoming podcast show with her and her friend.
I do.
Yeah, so we got a lot of good stuff going.
We got a lot of good things.
We're keeping the memories of baseball alive in every which way.
Right.
Thank you, gentlemen, all.
Thanks, Ralph.
Mr. Hubler, would you continue to keep coming back?
Oh, I'd love to. I enjoy it so much. Thank you, Ralph.
Beautiful. When I call, I just hope I'm not imposing on you because you got a good all you guys have good retirement lives going. You know what I'm saying?
Hey, I'm working full time. I'm not retired.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'm retired.
I'm retired, but I still love to talk baseball. So
yeah, well, that's
I'm retarded, and that's as close to being retarded as I'm. All right, guys. Everybody out there, please keep on keeping on, and we'll be back on a regular basis. See you next week, guys.
Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.